They say desperation sharpens the eye. I'd walked past the cave opening 3 times before I actually saw it. A dark mouth in the limestone cliff, half hidden by Virginia creeper, and 20 feet above the lakeshore. My daughter Maya was 7 then, sleeping in our rusted Civic with her backpack as a pillow, and I was 2 weeks from losing even that. The county impound notice was tucked in my pocket, creased from being read too many times. When I finally climbed up to that opening, flashlight trembling in my hand, I expected bats or a shallow depression, maybe a place to hide for one night before moving on again. What I found was a room, not a cave, a room. Someone had mortared the natural stone, framed an actual doorway, even installed a rotting wooden door that hung on one hinge. Inside, the space opened into something impossible. Walls smoothed with plaster, a stone hearth blackened by old fires, shelves carved into the rock itself, 18 feet deep, 12 wide, 8 high. A window had been cut through the cliff face, looking out over the lake, the glass long gone but the frame still solid, and on the floor, half buried in dust and leaves that had blown in over years, sat a metal toolbox with a name scratched into the lid. T. Bridger, 1987. I stood there as the sun dropped behind the ridge, knowing I'd found either salvation or another kind of trouble. The cave breathed around me, cold air moving through cracks, water dripping somewhere in the back, the smell of limestone and old smoke. Maya would wake up soon, hungry and asking again where we were going to sleep. I opened that toolbox with shaking hands. Inside, rusted hammers, a handsaw, nails in a coffee can, and beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth, a rolled-up paper that crackled when I touched it. I didn't look at it then. I just sat on the stone floor of that impossible room and let myself believe, for the first time in months, that we might have a roof. Chapter 1. The $15 deed. I bought the land for $15 at a county tax sale nobody else wanted. That sounds like a miracle. But miracles don't come with 23 years of back taxes, a property line dispute with the State Park Service, and a condemnation notice stapled to a tree at the access road. The listing said 0.3 acres, unbuildable, cliff-face terrain, no utilities, buyer assumes all liens. I had $17 in my wallet when I raised my hand at the auction. The clerk looked at me like I'd just volunteered for a firing squad. "You understand there's no structure?" she said, processing my crumpled bills. "And the access issues?" I understood plenty. I understood that Maya and I had 4 nights left in the parking lot behind the Super 8 before the manager called the cops again. I understood that every shelter in 3 counties had a 2-month waiting list. I understood that my ex-wife's lawyer was building a case around the word unstable, and sleeping in a car with our daughter was Exhibit A. "I understand," I told the clerk, and signed my name to a deed that smelled like basement mildew. Maya asked why we were hiking when I pulled her from the car that evening, her Disney backpack dragging in the gravel. She was so tired she didn't argue, just took my hand and followed me down the overgrown path that wound along the lakeshore. The county map showed the property line running right up to the cliff base, which meant the cave, if I could prove it was habitable, if I could show some kind of historical structure, might actually be legal shelter. The climb up to the opening was harder with Maya. I had to push her up ahead of me, her sneakers slipping on limestone until we both tumbled through into the cool darkness. I lit the battery lantern I'd bought with my last $3. "Is this a fort?" Maya whispered, and I heard hope in her voice for the first time in weeks. "It's a house," I told her. "Our house." That first night, we slept on the stone floor with our jackets as blankets. Maya curled against me, breathing softly, while I lay awake listening to the cave's small sounds, water dripping in steady rhythm, wind whistling through the window opening, and underneath it all, something else, a subtle vibration, like the stone itself was settling, adjusting to our presence. In the morning, gray light came through the east-facing window and caught dust motes drifting in the air. I looked up and saw, carved into the stone above the doorway, words I'd missed in the dark. Built 1986, 1989. T. Bridger. Home. Someone had lived here. Someone had built this place with their hands and called it home. And now, somehow, it was ours. I reached for the oilcloth-wrapped paper I'd found in the toolbox the night before. Maya was still asleep. My hands shook as I unrolled it on the floor. It was a hand-drawn floor plan, annotated in careful pencil. Cave house, Phase 1. The drawing showed this main room, but also something else. A second chamber deeper in marked storage workshop, with a note, natural chimney vent, needs clearing. And at the bottom, in different handwriting, more recent, "To whoever finds this, the work was worth it. Keep building. TB, 2008. I sat there as the sun rose over the lake, turning the water gold, and let myself believe we had a chance. Chapter 2. The decision to stay Maya found the first real clue 3 days in. While I was trying to patch the window frame with plastic sheeting and duct tape, she'd been exploring the back corner of the cave, where the natural stone curved into shadow, running her hands along the wall the way kids do when everything's still an adventure. "Dad, there's a door." I turned, zip ties hanging from my mouth, and saw her kneeling by what I'd thought was just a dark stain on the stone. But she was right. There was a shape there, about 3 feet high, like a small wooden hatch set flush into the rock. The wood was swollen with age, and I had to use the hammer from Bridger's toolbox to tap around the edges before it creaked open. Behind it, a crawl space that led deeper into the cliff, about 2 feet wide and 4 feet high. I shone the flashlight in and saw rough stone walls, tool marks from where someone had carved out the passage by hand, and about 10 feet back, the passage opened into another chamber. "We're not going in there," I said, my voice automatic with the kind of parental fear that comes from months of worst-case scenarios. "But the note said there was another room," Maya said, practical as always. "Maybe there's more stuff." She was right about that too. Before I could decide, she'd wriggled through the opening, her Disney backpack scraping against stone. I heard her gasp, "Dad, it's bigger. There's shelves and everything." I had no choice but to follow, crawling on my hands and knees through that narrow passage, the stone cold under my palms. The flashlight beam bounced crazily ahead of me. When I emerged into the second chamber, I had to kneel. The ceiling was only 5 feet high, but the room stretched back 15 feet, carved out of solid limestone. Natural ventilation came from a crack in the ceiling that let in a thread of daylight. And along the walls, built-in stone shelves held remnants of a life. Rusted cans, empty mason jars, a Coleman lantern, a stack of moldy paperback books, a box of tools better preserved than the ones in the front room. On the floor, pushed against the back wall, sat a wooden trunk with a padlock rusted through. I didn't open it then. The air in that chamber felt close, used up, and Maya was already coughing from the dust. But I could see papers through a gap in the boards, maybe old receipts or letters. Evidence of who T. Bridger was and why he'd carved a home into this cliff. We backed out through the crawl space, and I sealed the hatch with a tarp and bungee cords. "Tomorrow," I promised Maya, who was already asking what was in the trunk. "We need to make the front room livable first." That night, while Maya slept, I sat by the window opening and faced the real question. Did we stay? Or did I take this as the warning it probably was? The cave needed work. The property had liens I couldn't afford. My phone had 12 missed calls from my ex's lawyer. Every rational bone in my body said we should be in a shelter, going through the system, doing this the normal way. But I looked at Maya, her face peaceful for the first time in months, and I remembered what I'd promised her the night I lost the apartment, that I would find us a home, not temporary housing, not someone else's charity, a home. The cave breathed around me. Cold air moved through the window. Somewhere outside, an owl called across the lake, and I made my decision. We'd stay, we'd rebuild, and we'd figure out what T. Bridger had left behind. Chapter 3. Names carved in stone. The first week was survival. I hung tarps to seal the window and doorway, creating a buffer against the October wind that came off the lake every evening. Maya and I walked 2 miles to the dollar store and carried back supplies. A camp stove, paper plates, a water filter for the creek that ran down the cliff about 30 yards south. I used the last of my phone battery to research property law at the library's computer, learning that adverse possession might work in our favor if I could prove we were improving the property and that no one had disputed the claim. But the real work was psychological, learning to trust the stone. Every night the cave made sounds, creaks from temperature changes, drips from condensation, subtle groans as if the limestone was settling under its own weight. Maya would wake up scared, and I'd have to talk her through it, explaining each noise like I actually understood what was happening. The truth was, I was scared too, but the cave never felt hostile. It felt patient, like it had been waiting. I started mapping the place properly, measuring walls with a tape measure I found in the second toolbox. The main room was 18 feet by 12, just as I'd guessed. The ceiling was 8 feet at the center, 7 at the walls. The window opening faced due east, cut through 3 feet of solid limestone. The work that had gone into this place was staggering. Years of chiseling, hauling debris, fitting stones. Why? For what purpose had someone carved this home? The answer started revealing itself in the marks on the walls. Maya found the first one while I was trying to install a battery-powered LED strip along the ceiling. She was tracing her fingers over the plaster near the hearth, where decades of smoke had darkened everything, when she stopped. "Dad, there's writing." I climbed down and looked. Carved into a smooth section of plaster, about 3 feet off the ground, exactly Maya's height, were words in a careful, practiced hand. Lucy Bridger, age 8, helped build this hearth. July 1988. My chest went tight. A child had been here. A child had helped build this place. Over the next hour, we found more. Above the doorframe. First winter survived. Cold but safe. January 1987. On a support beam near the back. To whoever finds this, stay strong. The work gets easier. TB. Near the window. Views better than any apartment we had. Lucy agrees. Each mark was a message across time. Proof that this hadn't been just a desperate hideout, but a deliberate home. Someone had built this with love, with their daughter, with the same impossible hope that had brought me here. And then they'd left. Or maybe they'd been forced out, or maybe... What happened to them? Maya asked, her finger still tracing Lucy Bridger's name. I didn't have an answer, but I knew where we might find one. In that trunk in the back chamber, waiting in the dark with whatever secrets T. Bridger had left behind. The next morning, I crawled back through the passageway with a crowbar and Maya's flashlight. The trunk's padlock snapped off easily, the rust having done most of the work. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags that had mostly failed, I found a stack of journals, water-damaged but readable, a packet of seed envelopes labeled in neat handwriting, heirloom tomatoes from Lucy's school project, a folder of official-looking papers, a photo album with maybe 20 pictures inside, their colors faded but the images clear. A man in his 40s, lean and tired-looking, working on the cave. A girl with dark braids, smiling in front of the completed doorway. The two of them together by the lake, looking happy despite clothes that had seen better days. And at the very bottom, wrapped in wax paper and preserved almost perfectly, a letter addressed to the next builder. I didn't read it there, in that cramped back chamber with the dust thick in my throat. I gathered everything carefully and backed out through the passage, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Because these weren't just artifacts, they were answers. And sometimes answers came with costs. If you're enjoying this journey so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. Building with what we had. The letter stayed folded in my jacket for 2 days. I couldn't explain why I was afraid to read it, except that opening it felt like accepting responsibility for something bigger than just our survival. Meanwhile, the practical work had to continue. The cave was shelter, but barely. We needed heat, better water management, some way to cook that didn't fill the room with propane fumes. I started with the hearth. T. Bridger had built it correctly, with a stone chimney that vented through a natural crack in the ceiling. But decades of neglect had left it clogged with debris. I spent a full day clearing it, sending Maya outside to watch for smoke, until finally a small test fire drew properly and the smoke curled up and out, disappearing into the cliff above us. That night we had our first real cooked meal, rice and beans made on the camp stove, but eaten by the warmth of burning wood. Maya sat cross-legged by the fire, watching the flames like they were magic, and for a moment I let myself feel something dangerous. Pride. "It's like camping," she said, "but forever." "It's like camping," I agreed, "but home." The work became a rhythm. Mornings I'd walk to the road and check the property line markers, making sure no one from the state park had come nosing around. Then back to the cave for repairs, patching plaster, improving drainage, building a rain catchment system using salvaged gutters from the county dump. I found odd jobs in town, landscaping, helping at the hardware store, enough to buy better materials, a decent tarp, thermal blankets for winter. A neighbor from the far side of the lake, an older man named Carl who fished every morning, started appearing at the cliff base with gifts he pretended were accidents, had extra lumber from a project, or battery went dead in this radio, figured you could fix it. He never climbed up to the cave, never asked invasive questions, just left things and moved on. His way of saying he'd seen us, he understood, he wouldn't call anyone. One day he called up from below. "Storm coming tonight. Big one. You folks got everything battened down?" I looked at our setup, tarps held with rope, a doorway covered with plastic sheeting, a window that was basically open to the elements despite my best efforts. "We'll manage," I called back. Carl nodded. unconvinced. Check your ceiling for leaks. Stone weeps in weather like this. He was gone before I could thank him. That evening, following his advice, I mapped every crack in the ceiling with a marker, setting out our few pots and pans to catch drips. Maya helped, making it into a game, giving each leak a name. "This one's Freddy," she said, positioning a plastic bowl. "He's the worst." The storm hit around midnight. Rain hammered the cliff face with a sound like continuous thunder, and within an hour every container was full, water streaming down the walls despite our preparations. The wind found every gap in our ceiling, and the tarps snapped and bellowed like they were trying to tear free. Maya pressed against me, scared but determined not to cry, while I held the flashlight and watched the ceiling for signs of real trouble. Around 2 a.m., a section of plaster near the back started to crumble, and I saw something I'd missed before. A gap in the stone above, deliberately carved but concealed by plaster. Water was pouring through it now, but the gap was too regular to be natural. It looked intentional. I couldn't investigate with the storm raging, but I marked the spot mentally. Another mystery left by T. Bridger, another piece of the puzzle. By dawn, the storm had passed. We were soaked, exhausted, and our supplies were water damaged. But the cave had held. The stone had protected us, just as it had protected the Bridgers 3 decades before. And in that gap in the ceiling, once I could safely climb up and look, I found something that would change everything. A plastic-wrapped bundle shoved deep into a carved-out niche, completely hidden until the plaster failed. Inside the bundle, more journals, bank statements from 1989 to 1990, and a property deed that made my blood run cold. Because according to these documents, T. Bridger hadn't owned this land either. He'd been squatting, just like us, building a home in borrowed space. And the reason he'd left was right there in black and white. An eviction notice from September 1990, court order attached, giving him 30 days to vacate or face criminal trespass charges. He'd lost everything, and if I wasn't careful, we would too. Chapter 5. The Truth in the Journals. I started reading the journals that afternoon while Maya napped, her exhaustion from the storm finally catching up. T. Bridger's handwriting was small and precise, the entries dated but irregular, sometimes weeks passing between them. The first journal began in winter 1986. Lost the apartment December 1st. Lucy's school doesn't know yet. Sleeping in the truck, looking for anything we can afford. Found the cave today. It's just a hole now, but it could be more. It has to be more. The entries tracked his transformation of the cave. First weeks of just sleeping there, then beginning the real work with borrowed tools. He'd been a carpenter by trade before an injury disabled his left hand. Ending his career and starting a downward slide he chronicled with brutal honesty. Savings depleted, job applications rejected, Lucy's mother leaving them both, the shame of failing to provide. But woven through the desperation was something else, a growing obsession with the cave itself. He wrote about the stone like a partner in the work, describing how it told him where to chisel, where to support, where to leave intact. "The limestone wants to shelter," he wrote in March 1987. "I just have to help it remember how." By summer 1987, he'd completed the main room and started on the back chamber. Lucy, then 6, helped where she could, mixing mortar, holding boards, decorating with carvings. The entries from that period were almost happy, filled with small victories. "First fire in the hearth tonight." Lucy said it feels more like home than the apartment ever did. But the tone shifted in late 1989. Financial pressure mounted. The county discovered their presence somehow. Maybe a hiker, maybe a tax record review. The entries became terse, anxious. Letter from the county. They want us out. Claiming it's unsafe, but really they just can't classify it. Lucy doesn't understand why we have to leave something we built ourselves. The last entry was dated September 15th, 1990. The court gave me 30 days. I can't fight it. No money for lawyers, and legally I never had claim to this land anyway. Lucy's going to live with her aunt in Montana. Better schools there, better everything. But this cave, I'm sealing up what I can, leaving notes for whoever finds it next. Maybe they'll have better luck. Maybe the world will change. Or maybe this place will just sit here empty waiting until the stone forgets us completely. I sat there with the journal open on my lap, my throat tight. T. Bridger had lost, had done everything right, built something beautiful with his own hands, given his daughter a home, and still lost to the simple fact that he had no legal standing, no resources, no way to fight the system that cared more about categories than people. Maya woke up and found me staring at nothing. "What's wrong?" she asked, that edge of fear back in her voice. the one that said she knew stability was always temporary. Nothing's wrong, I lied, pulling her close. But I couldn't stop thinking about that eviction notice, about how history might repeat itself if I couldn't find a way forward that T. Bridger hadn't seen. That night, I finally read the letter he'd left to the next builder. It was short, written on the back of a property survey. To whoever finds this place, I built it because I had no choice and stayed because it gave me something that couldn't be evicted. Pride. The county took the land, but they never took what we built here. These walls remember us. If you're reading this, you're probably desperate like I was. My advice, don't just survive here. Document everything. Take pictures. Keep records. Make it so they can't pretend you don't exist. And if you have to leave, leave something behind that proves you mattered. That's all any of us can do. TB. The next morning, I bought a disposable camera at the dollar store and started photographing everything. The cave's dimensions, every improvement we made. Maya doing homework by lantern light, the carvings on the walls. I wrote detailed notes about our repairs, saved every receipt, documented every day. Because if we were going to fight for this place, we'd need proof that we'd turned it from an empty hole into a home. And then I started researching something that had been nagging at me since finding the property deed: historical preservation. If I could prove the cave had historical significance, if I could get it recognized as a heritage structure, maybe, just maybe, we'd have grounds for a claim that even the county would have to respect. It was a long shot, but it was something. And right now, something was all we had. Chapter 6. When the ground shook, the Historical Society lady came on a Tuesday morning, picking her way down the overgrown path with visible reluctance. Her name was Margaret Santos, and she'd agreed to visit only after I'd sent her scanned copies of Bridger's journals and photos from the 1980s, claiming I'd discovered a potentially significant example of vernacular architecture and alternative housing history. She stood at the base of the cliff looking up at the cave opening with the expression of someone who'd been promised a treasure and found a garbage dump. "It's a carved cave," she said flatly. "It's a hand-built dwelling with 30-plus years of continuous habitation evidence," I countered, trying to sound like I knew what I was talking about. "The construction techniques are documented, the materials are period-appropriate, and the social history is significant." Maya appeared at the cave opening above us, curious, and Margaret's face softened slightly. "You're living up there? With a child?" "We're preserving it," I said, which was technically true. Margaret made the climb, and I watched her face change as she entered the main room. Whatever skepticism she'd brought with her started to crack as she examined the handiwork. The mortared walls, the carved hearth, the beamwork, the integrated shelving. She ran her fingers along the plaster near the doorway, reading Lucy Bridger's carved name. "This is remarkable," she admitted. "Not professionally built, obviously, but the craftsmanship and the documentation you have." She pulled out her phone, taking pictures. "The Historical Society has been documenting alternative housing in the region, people who fell through the cracks during the 80s recession. This could be an important case study." Hope flared in my chest. "Does that mean—" "It means I'll present it to the board," Margaret interrupted. "But I can't promise anything. Heritage designation is political, and the county might resist anything that seems to legitimize squatting." She spent 2 hours measuring, photographing, reading through the journals I'd carefully preserved. Before she left, she turned to me at the cave entrance, her expression unreadable. "You should know, if this gets designated, you still might not be able to stay. Historical structures have maintenance requirements, public access rules, but it would protect the cave itself. The work wouldn't be forgotten." After she left, I sat on the stone floor, trying to decide if I'd just made things better or worse. Maya was quiet, sensing my uncertainty. "If we have to leave," she said finally, "will someone else get to live here?" "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it'll just be preserved, like a museum." "That's dumb," Maya said with the direct logic of 7-year-olds. "It's a house. Houses are for living in." She was right, of course, but the world didn't always work according to 7-year-old logic. 2 weeks later, the letter came. Not from the Historical Society, but from the county. A notice of inspection scheduled for December 15th, 3 weeks away. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. They were checking habitability, safety, and legal occupancy. If we failed, they'd have grounds for eviction. I read the notice 3 times, my hands shaking. This was it, the same process that had forced out the Bridgers. arriving right on schedule like history was determined to repeat itself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the lakeshore and stood watching moonlight on the water, trying to figure out what T. Bridger had missed, what angle he hadn't seen. The cave was safe. I'd made sure of that. The construction was sound. We weren't bothering anyone, but none of that mattered if we couldn't prove legal right to be there. I was still standing there when I heard footsteps behind me. Carl, the fisherman, emerging from the darkness with his tackle box. "Heard you got a county notice," he said without preamble. I tensed. "How'd you hear that?" "My daughter works at the courthouse. She thought I should know, given—" He gestured vaguely at the cliff. "Listen, I don't have all the answers, but I know someone who might help. Lawyer I used to work with does pro bono property stuff sometimes. No promises, but—" He handed me a business card. "Tell her Carl sent you, and tell her about the cave's history. Might make a difference." He was gone before I could properly thank him, melting back into the pre-dawn darkness like some kind of guardian spirit. I looked at the card in the moonlight. Rebecca Chen, Property Rights Law. When I climbed back up to the cave, Maya was awake, sitting by the window watching the sunrise. "Is someone going to take our house?" she asked. I could have lied. Should have, probably. But I'd promised myself when we moved in that I wouldn't do to her what my parents had done to me. Pretend everything was fine until the day it all collapsed. "Maybe," I said, "but we're going to fight. And this time, we have something T. Bridger didn't have." "What's that?" "Proof that we were here, that we mattered, and people who saw us. If this restoration story has you hooked, hit like. It helps us bring more lost places back to life." Chapter 7. The advocate Rebecca Chen came to the cave 3 days later, and she brought an energy that felt like weather changing. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with ink-stained fingers and a laptop bag that looked like it had survived multiple hurricanes. She climbed up to the cave entrance like she did this every day, barely winded, and her first words were, "Carl said you're squatting in a historical structure. That's either the worst situation possible, or the best. Let's figure out which." I showed her everything. The deed I'd bought at auction, the tax records, the lien documents, the journals, the photos, Margaret's preliminary assessment from the Historical Society. She spread it all out on the stone floor and worked through it methodically, occasionally typing notes or pulling up cases on her laptop. "The good news," she said after an hour, "is that the property deed you bought is technically valid. The county sold it to you, which means they acknowledged your right to purchase. The bad news is that unbuildable classification means they never expected you to occupy it, which gives them grounds to claim you're violating use restrictions." "But someone already built here," I argued. "The cave is the improvement, we're just maintaining it." "That's the argument we'll make. The cave predates current zoning restrictions. It's a grandfathered structure. But we'll need to prove continuous historical use, which means demonstrating that it was never truly abandoned." She looked at me sharply. "When you found it, was there any evidence of recent use? Even small things? Recent trash? Fresh marks? Anything?" I thought back to that first night, remembering the toolbox, the wrapped journals, the preserved state of the interior. "It was sealed," I said slowly, like someone had closed it up carefully. "Not abandoned, mothballed." "That's useful." Rebecca made notes. "Intention matters. If Bridger sealed it rather than abandoning it, we can argue he meant for it to be returned to. Did he have family who might have rights?" My stomach dropped. "A daughter, Lucy. She'd be about 40 now. We need to find her," Rebecca said immediately. "If she has no claim, or if she'll support your occupancy, that strengthens your position. If she wants it back," she left that possibility hanging. Over the next week, Rebecca turned the cave into a command center. She brought a portable printer, document folders, and a determination that bordered on obsessive. We researched property law, historical precedents, cases where squatters had successfully claimed ownership through adverse possession, or where historical significance had overridden zoning restrictions. Meanwhile, Maya had started school, a complicated process involving a borrowed address from Carl and me walking her 3 miles each way to avoid questions about where we actually lived. But it gave us legitimacy, proof we were invested in the community, not just passing through. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret from the Historical Society called with news. The board had voted to recommend the cave for preliminary heritage designation, citing its significance as an example of Depression-era survivalist architecture techniques persisting into the late 20th century. It wasn't official yet, but it was something. "They want to do a feature," Margaret said, "for the county newsletter. Would you be willing to be interviewed?" Rebecca grabbed the phone from my hand. Absolutely not. No publicity until after the inspection. We need to control the narrative. And right now the narrative is responsible caretakers preserving a historical structure, not homeless man squatting in a cave. She was right, but it stung, because that's what we were, homeless people squatting in a cave. All the journals and heritage designations in the world didn't change the fundamental truth of our situation. That night, after Rebecca left, I opened the last of Bridger's journals, the one I'd been avoiding because I knew it would hurt. The entries from his final days in the cave were short, bitter. September 20th, 1990. Lucy asked if we could come back someday when she's older. I told her maybe, but I know we won't. Places like this don't wait for people like us. But then, on the last page, a final note added later, the handwriting shakier. December 2008. Came back today after 18 years. The cave is still here, untouched, waiting. I was wrong. Some places do wait. I'm sealing this journal inside with a new letter just in case. If you're reading this, you found what I couldn't keep. Don't give it up easy. It's worth fighting for. TB. I sat there holding the journal, my eyes burning. He'd come back. After losing everything, after years away, he'd returned to check on this place he'd built with his hands, and he'd left instructions for the next person, for us, knowing that the cave would eventually offer shelter to someone else who needed it. The next morning, Rebecca arrived with news. She'd found Lucy Bridger, now Lucy Bridger Martin, living in Billings, Montana, and Rebecca had called her. She cried, Rebecca said simply. Said she thinks about the cave all the time, but she assumed it was destroyed years ago. She has no interest in claiming it. In fact, she wants to write a letter supporting your preservation efforts. I felt something crack open in my chest. She'd do that? She said her dad would want the cave to shelter someone who needed it. That was always the point. December 15th arrived with the weight of Judgment Day. The county inspector was a middle-aged woman named Patricia Vole, and she came with a clipboard, a camera, and a skepticism so thick you could taste it. Rebecca accompanied us, her laptop bag on her shoulder like a weapon. Patricia climbed up to the cave and began her inspection. She measured ceiling heights, checked structural integrity, tested the hearth draw, examined our water filtration system. She took pictures of everything, the carved names on the walls, the built-in shelving, the improvements we'd made. It's not up to code, she said finally. No permanent electricity, no plumbing, no proper insulation. It predates code, Rebecca interrupted smoothly. And historical structures are typically exempt from modern building requirements if they can prove they're being maintained appropriately. Assuming it gets historical designation, Patricia countered. The Historical Society has already recommended it. Rebecca pulled out documents. And we have testimonial from the original builder's family supporting current occupancy. Patricia looked at me, at Maya standing quietly by the hearth, at the cave that had been transformed from an abandoned hole to a living home. Her expression was unreadable. I'll file my report, she said. But off the record? This shouldn't exist. People can't just carve houses into cliffs and call it legal. Why not? Maya asked suddenly, her voice small but clear. If nobody else wanted it and we made it better, why can't we stay? Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Then she closed her clipboard and started down the cliff without another word. We waited 2 weeks for the report. They were the longest 2 weeks of my life. Chapter 8. The letter that changed everything. The report came back with an unexpected classification. Conditionally approved pending historical review. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. We could stay through the winter while the historical designation process continued, as long as we met certain safety requirements and maintained documentation of all preservation activities. Rebecca called it a miracle. I called it a temporary reprieve that could evaporate any moment. But Maya, in her 7-year-old wisdom, called it what it actually was. They're letting us stay. The Historical Society moved forward with formal designation, and suddenly we weren't just squatters anymore. We were caretakers of a heritage site. Margaret arranged for a small grant to fund stabilization work, proper window installation, improved water management, structural assessment by an engineer who spent 3 hours examining the cave and declared it surprisingly sound, given the unconventional construction. But the real transformation came from the community. Word spread about the cave, about our fight to stay, about T. Bridger's story and Lucy's letter of support. The county newspaper ran a feature, this time with Rebecca's approval, about the cave that refused to die. And suddenly people started showing up. A retired contractor brought weather stripping and showed me how to properly seal the door frame. A teacher from Maya's school donated books and a battery-powered reading lamp. Someone left a box of winter clothes at the trail entrance with a note. For the Cave family. Carl organized a group of locals to haul up a wood stove, a proper one, vented correctly, and helped me install it properly. "Can't have you burning the place down after all this work," he said gruffly, but his eyes were wet when he saw the finished installation. The cave changed with each improvement. The constant dampness receded with proper ventilation. The cold became manageable with insulation and the new stove. Maya's drawings appeared on the walls, joining the carved names and dates, adding our layer to the history. I kept detailed journals, just like Bridger had, documenting not just the physical improvements but also what it felt like to transform from homeless father to homesteader, from desperate squatter to recognized resident. Lucy Bridger Martin sent a package in December. Inside, more photos of her father working on the cave, a letter addressed to Maya about what it was like growing up there, and something that made me cry when I saw it. The original seeds from her father's garden project, carefully preserved for 35 years in a freezer. He always hoped someone would plant them, Lucy wrote. He said they were survivor seeds, tough varieties that could grow in difficult conditions, just like the people who'd live in the cave. That evening I sat by the new wood stove and opened the letter T. Bridger had written, to the next builder, the first one I'd found in the toolbox, which I'd read a dozen times but never fully absorbed. But now, with months of struggle behind us and the beginning of security ahead, the words hit differently. To the next builder. By now you've probably figured out that this cave isn't just shelter. It's proof that people can build homes anywhere if they're determined enough. I built it because I had to, but I stayed because I wanted to. There's a difference. The first is survival. The second is living. Make sure you know which one you're doing, and if you have to leave someday, like I did, make sure you leave instructions. Make sure the next person knows they're not the first to need this place and they won't be the last. We're all just borrowing time and space. The best we can do is leave it better than we found it. TB. I looked around at the cave. Our cave now. Transformed by months of work and community support. The hearth burning warm. Maya asleep in her corner with her new books. The walls bearing the marks of 3 generations of survivors. And I realized Bridger had been wrong about one thing. This place didn't belong to whoever claimed it. It belonged to everyone who'd needed it, who'd improved it, who'd left their mark for the next person. But he'd been right about the crucial thing. We weren't just surviving here anymore. We were living. The next morning, I started clearing the area around the cave entrance, planning where to plant Lucy's survivor seeds in the spring. Maya helped, her small hands moving rocks, already talking about what vegetables we'd grow. And as we worked, I noticed something I'd somehow missed in all the months of repairs and legal battles. On the cliff face above the cave entrance, nearly weathered away but still visible in the right light, was a carved message I'd never seen before. Home is where you build it. TB, 1987. It was that simple, that profound. We were home,